Once upon a time, a self-styled dictator with a Godzilla obsession kidnapped an internationally celebrated film director and forced him to make a Juche monster movie, and the project was completed with the actual Godzilla suit actor and an army of real soldiers as extras. Sounds like a B-movie plot itself, doesn't it? But in the magic kingdom of North Korea, everything is possible. Pulgasari is the final product, a Juche Godzilla monster film produced under the watchful eye of future leader Kim Jong-il, using an abducted South Korean director and Japan's Godzilla team. The making of Pulgasari is one of the wildest behind-the-scenes stories in cinema, a mashup of propaganda and kaiju absurdity that evolved into a cult legend. How did a poverty-stricken, isolationist regime end up creating a giant rubber suit monster epic? Buckle up. This story involves international criminal plots, brainwashing banquets, massive battle scenes with 13,000 extras, and a monster so hungry it nearly devours its own propaganda. When the real Godzilla's stunt actor flew to Pyongyang to stomp around in a monster suit just for the dear leader's cinematic dream, you know that it is the weirdest movie saga in our human history. Let's dig in. Our story begins not on a film set, but with an obsessive cinephile who accidentally happened to be a dictator's son. If you've watched our previous episode, you know that Kim Jong-il, long before inheriting power, was utterly in love with movies. He fervently believed that controlling the narrative on screen meant controlling the hearts of the people, and he craved to elevate North Korean cinema to world-class levels as a form of soft power. But mere passion wasn't enough. North Korea's film industry was technically primitive and creatively stagnant, a fact that gnawed at Kim. So the playboy princeling of Pyongyang hatched a drastic plan: import talent by force. So who should he abduct? I guess you've already known it. Dear leader chose Shin Sang-ok, once the prince of South Korean cinema, and his hostage ex-wife, Choi Eun-hee, the most glamorous actress of her era. In the 1950s and 60s, they were film royalty. Shin was a cinematic powerhouse, directing over 70 films and founding his own studio, Shin Films, which practically created the country's post-war movie boom. He was a master of melodrama, and his work elevated South Korean cinema to the international level at a time when the nation was still picking shrapnel out of its teeth from the Korean War. Choi Eun-hee, meanwhile, was the national actress. Elegant and commanding, she was the star in everything from tragic romances to patriotic historical epics. Shin and Choi were Korea's answer to Liz Taylor and Richard Burton, except with fewer yachts, more film reels, and a legendary story with the prince from the north. If history has taught us one thing, remember, no one's reign lasts forever. Unfortunately, by the early 70s, the couple's cinematic empire started crumbling. The South Korean government, under military dictatorship, imposed stricter censorship. Shin gradually found himself increasingly at odds with the junta government. He refused to toe the political line, and the whole South Korean film industry started to shun away from him.
감독상에는 사랑방 손님과 어머니의 신상옥 씨, 그리고 여우 주연상에는 상록수의 최은희 양.
대단히 감개무량합니다. 너무나 가슴이 벅차올라서 뭐라고 말씀을 드려야 좋을지.
box office tastes changed too, as audiences began shifting toward television, international imports, and more modern storytelling. Che and Shin divorced in 1976. The Shin films filed for bankruptcy, and Shin's name was fading into obscurity. For a man who once ran Korea's most prolific studio and lived like an industry emperor, it was a steep fall. The couple who once dined with generals and diplomats now found themselves broke, blacklisted, and artistically orphaned. Well, when Shin and Che were being sidelined by the South Korean Authority, someone up north had a very interesting idea. When other people saw it as a tragedy, our dear leader saw it as an unprecedented opportunity. In 1978, under Kim Jong-il's secret orders, North Korean agents carried out a cinematic kidnapping scheme that sounds straight out of a thriller. The filmmaking couple was lured to Hong Kong, grabbed off the street by secret North Korean operatives, and shipped to North Korea. At the time, nobody could imagine the culprit was Kim Jong-il, the future leader of North Korea, nor the bizarre motive behind these abductions. In North Korea, Shin and Che found their new producer was none other than movie buff Kim. Once in Pyongyang, the couple's nightmare began. They were essentially indentured film laborers for North Korea's regime. After some re-education to let the couple accept their situation, Kim Jong-il wasted no time putting his captives to work. Under constant surveillance, Shin Sang-ok was tasked with invigorating North Korean cinema and showing the world the genius of the general's filmmaking vision. From 1983 to 1985, Shin directed a string of films in North Korea, and some of them were remarkably allowed to be submitted to international festivals. Kim was thrilled. This odd partnership of brutal coercion and creative collaboration was actually yielding results. The producer Kim decided it was the correct time for an international blockbuster, a monster epic, Pulgasari. Kim Jong-il's ultimate passion project with Shin Sang-ok was Pulgasari, a period kaiju movie like nothing North Korea had ever attempted. When Kim was going to make a socialist Godzilla, he spared no expense. The behind-the-scenes story of Pulgasari's production is so crazy that it's hard to tell where we should begin. First, to understand why a monster film, we must understand Godzilla first. Godzilla wasn't just a guy in a rubber suit stomping on model cities. Born from Japan's trauma after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Godzilla was a walking nuclear metaphor, the embodiment of mankind's hubris and the unleashed vengeance of the radioactive. As the franchise grew through the 60s and 70s, Godzilla evolved into something more mythic, sometimes savior, sometimes destroyer. He fought alien invaders, other monsters, environmental pollution, and Cold War anxieties. Kim Jong-il saw in Godzilla everything he wanted North Korean cinema to be: spectacle with meaning. Yes, to weirdly put it, the Godzilla genre was born with political symbolism. The giant monster uses and controls the audience's fear and imagination. Besides, it is a cool, entertaining and popular niche that is packed with special visual effects and a loyal audience. So why not create a Godzilla-like film, but with Juche ideology? A monster that would rise, defend the poor, crush the corrupt, and devour all symbols of capitalist decay. Not as a metaphor, but as unambiguous political messages, or say propaganda. So, under the world's strangest executive producer with a Godzilla complex, and once the star director kidnapped from the South, the Pulgasari project was put forward in February 1985. To produce this big-budget monster film, Kim built an entirely new film studio complex. Shin Sang-ok noted that Kim himself never visited the set. Yet he was so invested in Pulgasari that he staunchly ordered nationwide support for the project. He authorized construction of a facility with one huge office building, 4 sound stages, 6 audio recording studios, and 6 screening rooms, all to support this single film. North Korea basically had no experience with special effects extravaganzas, so the dear leader created the infrastructure from scratch.
Having pinpointed cinema as the main link in the whole chain of art and literature, he visited the film studios many times, giving guidance to each process of creative work, screenplay writing to start with.
Recognizing North Korea's technical limitations, Kim did something unthinkable. He outsourced expertise from Japan, the nation's former enemy. Through secret arrangements, Japan's Toho Studios, famed for the Godzilla franchise, sent a 15-member crew to Pyongyang to handle the monster effects. This crew included some of the top special effects talent of the time, even the man inside the Godzilla suit himself, Kenpachiro Satsuma. Now he donned the Pulgasari monster suit on set, making him the first and only Japanese suitmation actor to ever work in North Korea. Imagine the culture shock for Toho's team. They flew into the Hermit Kingdom under tight secrecy to film a Godzilla-like monster movie for the Crown Prince. According to Satsuma, the budget was estimated at $2 to $3 million, an astronomical sum for North Korea in the 1980s, and about 13,000 background actors were employed. The Korean People's Army was even mobilized to supply men and resources for battle scenes, effectively turning the film into a quasi-military exercise. It makes the record that Pulgasari was by far the largest, most expensive film in North Korean history up to that time. A monster-sized vanity project. So, with the generous funding directly from Kim's coffer, multiple monster suits were created to portray Pulgasari's growth from pint-sized to giant. These suits were all custom-made in Japan by Toho's experts, and then smuggled to North Korea. The film employed elaborate miniature sets and pyrotechnics to imitate the classic Godzilla flick, like those castles and villages built to be smashed by the monster. Surprisingly, Satsuma found performing Pulgasari somewhat easier than his Godzilla gigs. Why? Pulgasari has no tail, so the suit was less cumbersome and allowed more mobility. Satsuma even cheekily remarked to the media later that he considered Pulgasari a superior film to Godzilla, though one imagines he said that with a wink, perhaps out of politeness to his North Korean hosts. In the kingdom, dear leader treated the visiting Japanese crew like honored guests, just with a little bit of eavesdropping. Satsuma and the Toho team were put up in one of Kim Jong-il's private villas, each member given a spacious, well-furnished room with a bed, television, bookshelf, radio, even a fully stocked refrigerator, like prisoners in a gilded cage. It was a far cry from typical North Korean living conditions, which the crew realized quickly. Their villa, however, likely had some extra features. The Toho staff felt suspicious that their rooms were bugged with hidden microphones, and this speculation was soon confirmed in a darkly comedic way. One evening, the Japanese crew was chatting in their quarters, wistfully discussing how nice it would be to drink some Japanese beer, which they certainly hadn't seen in North Korea. Lo and behold, the very next day, their fridges were mysteriously stocked with Japanese brand beer. Yes, someone had been listening to their wishful thinking, and the regime can fulfill them easily. Call it hospitality at the cost of a little bit of surveillance. The crew got their beer, but also the unsettling confirmation that Big Brother Kim was always listening, even to offhand cravings. Despite the massive budget and support, North Korea's infrastructure woes still plagued production. There were still primitive problems. The crew faced frequent power outages that could halt filming, and even instances of equipment theft. Some of the high-end gear brought in would vanish, presumably borrowed, by locals unaccustomed to such technology. The shooting environment was also far from glamorous. Director Shin Sang-ok's own office at the new studio, for example, had windows with no glass installed. In the chilly Korean winter, Shin sat trying to work in essentially an open-air office. The room as cold as the outdoors, because someone forgot to or couldn't provide some glasses. So, while money was being thrown at the project, basic comfort was not always guaranteed. One could say Pulgasari's production swung wildly between extremes of luxury and the typical hardship of North Korea's reality.
For the further development of cinematic art, Kim Jong-il advanced a germ for an idea of multi-part films like Star of Korea and guided their filming on the spot.
In an effort to make Pulgasari as grand as possible, Kim Jong-il even roped in overseas locations and partners. Key scenes were filmed on location in China's Forbidden City, the iconic Imperial Palace in Beijing, with cooperation from the Beijing Film Studio. So Pulgasari was technically a co-production between North Korea, production team, South Korea, director, Japan, actors and effects, and China, shooting location. Wow, what an East Asian collaboration. It's astonishing to realize that the Forbidden City, a world-famous landmark, served as a backdrop for a North Korean monster movie. This happened entirely due to Kim's clout. Few, if any, North Korean films have had such foreign assistance to shoot scenes from the old Chinese palaces. Kim's special status and connection to the CCP opened doors to make the medieval Korean setting of the film look convincingly epic with real ancient architecture. These told, Pulgasari's production was a perfect combination of filmmaking ambition and dictatorial insanity. Shin Sang-ok had virtually unlimited resources at his disposal, courtesy of a man who would stop at nothing to get his cinematic masterpiece. Yet Shin himself was under unimaginable pressure. Deliver a fantastic film or face dire consequences. Armed guards were ever present, and while Kim gave creative leeway on technical matters, the film's message and success were of paramount importance. In this bizarre environment, Shin managed to actually craft a coherent film. We have to give him credit. Pulgasari was finally completed in late 1985, an extravagant mashup of feudal Korean drama and giant monster rampage that Kim Jong-il proudly stamped his name on as executive producer. So, should we now dive into the movie itself? Comrade, please get ready that the plot of Pulgasari is just as wild as the story behind the camera.
이놈들아, 눈통을 맞춰라! 눈통을!
Pulgasari is set in feudal Korea during the waning days of the Goryeo dynasty, like the 14th century, and it doesn't shy away from hammering home a class struggle narrative. The opening paints a picture of peasants under the yoke of a ruthless monarchy. A tyrannical king and his corrupt officials are bleeding the people dry, seizing food and metal and leaving farmers to starve. Famine and desperation rule the land. In a small mountain village, we meet an old blacksmith named Taksei. Taksei is renowned as the best blacksmith around, a man of skill and conscience. He has 2 children, a daughter named Ami and a younger son, Anna. Ami has a sweetheart lover, Inde, a young Robin Hood-like peasant rebel who was stealing from the government granaries to feed the poor and secretly forging weapons to start an uprising. The stage is set: oppressed villagers, a budding rebellion, and a cruel regime cracking down. The king's governor arrives in the village with a terrible demand. The peasants must turn over all their iron tools and cookware to be melted into weapons for the royal army. Pots, ploughs, knives, even farming tools are confiscated, leaving the people with nothing to cook in or work their fields. Soldiers go door to door, grabbing every scrap of metal, enforcing this order with brute force. It's portrayed in tragic detail. Families wail as their cooking pots are taken, and anyone who resists is beaten by the thuggish soldiers. Young Inde and his band of idealistic rebels can't stand by, and thus intervene in a clash between soldiers and villagers. But they're outmatched in weapons and numbers. Inde and his friends get arrested and thrown into prison. The situation seems hopeless for the village. Old Taksei, the blacksmith, is then commanded by the authorities to forge weapons for the army using the collected iron. But Taksei has a clever defiance in mind. He secretly tells villagers to hide some of their metal tools instead of surrendering them all. When the soldiers realize a chunk of metal has gone missing, they suspect the blacksmith of trickery. The local governor is furious and has Taksei arrested. They torture the old blacksmith mercilessly, demanding he snitch about the stolen iron. Yet Taksei refuses to incriminate his neighbors. Instead, in a stroke of defiant creativity, he declares that the missing iron must have been eaten by the legendary metal-eating monster of folklore, a creature called Pulgasari, which means undying or immortal in Korean, that supposedly roams the countryside, devouring metal. The officials scoff at this as a ridiculous lie. Enraged, the governor orders Taksei to be starved in prison until he confesses. Now comes a rather dark and magical turning point. Imprisoned and deprived of food, Taksei is on death's door. His daughter Ami attempts to sneak him rice by tossing little rice balls through the prison bars. But the proud old man decides to sacrifice himself rather than live serving tyranny. In his final moments, the starving Taksei takes the rice that Ami gave him and mixes it with dirt on the cell floor. With trembling hands, he shapes this crude dough into a small figurine of a monster, a tiny idol of Pulgasari. As he molds this figurine, Taksei prays fervently over it, pouring all his hope and despair into a last wish: that the gods will bring this monster to life to protect the poor and avenge the oppressed. It's a surprisingly emotional scene. The old man essentially gives his life to create a protector for his people. With that final prayer, Taksei dies of starvation, the little mud rice monster figurine clutched in his hands, which then glows mysteriously. Ami is devastated by her father's death. After his body is removed, she finds the curious handmade figurine among his belongings and brings it home, not yet knowing its power. Soon after, one night, as Ami is sewing, she accidentally pricks her finger. A drop of her blood falls onto the figurine. In that instant, the little monster figurine springs to life, transformed by the blood of a pure-hearted girl. It becomes Pulgasari, initially a cute, diminutive creature about the size of a small doll. Pulgasari resembles a horned dragon-ox hybrid, kind of adorable really, and it immediately proves its identity by gobbling up the steel sewing needle Ami dropped. Yes, this creature lives up to legend. It eats metal ravenously. Ami and her brother are stunned but delighted, believing this must be the guardian beast their father spoke of. They adopt little Pulgasari like a family pet that somehow eats nails and needles. However, the critter's appetite is insatiable. By the next day, it's broken into Taksei's old smithy and devoured a bunch of iron tools. Each meal makes the creature grow in size. The legend is coming true before their eyes. Meanwhile, Inde, Ami's lover, is scheduled for execution by the governor for his rebel activity. On the day of execution, Ami rushes to the site, hoping for a miracle. Just as the executioner's blade is about to fall on Inde, Pulgasari, who currently has the size of a dog, bursts onto the scene. The little monster bites straight through the executioner's sword and even snaps the chains binding Inde. It was pandemonium. The soldiers, shocked by this unexpected monster attack, lose control of the situation. Villagers riot and help Inde escape in the confusion. Pulgasari scampers off, having saved the day. Word of the metal-eating monster disrupting the execution spreads fast. The local governor is livid and unbelieving. He dismisses reports of a monster as nonsense until Pulgasari makes another appearance, this time raiding the governor's armory to feast on weapons. By the time the governor and his men catch up, Pulgasari has eaten its fill of swords and spears and grown to the size of a human adult. The soldiers attack it, but swords and arrows do nothing. The beast has its superpower. Pulgasari smashes through a wall and escapes into the night, leaving the governor furious and a little frightened. At this point, the villagers are a mix of awestruck and anxious. Pulgasari seems to be on their side, but it also ate a lot of their iron cooking pots in the process, which doesn't exactly endear it to everyone. Ami, however, firmly believes Pulgasari is a divine protector, sent by her father's spirit. She, her brother, and Inde regard the monster with affection and begin actively seeking it out in the countryside to keep it safe. They sense that a turning point in their rebellion is at hand. The governor, desperate to quash the growing peasant revolt, retaliates with cruelty. He tortures Inde's elderly mother to force the rebels to surrender. When Ami learns that Inde's mother has been captured, she races to the secret mountain hideout where Inde and his fellow fugitives are training. She delivers the bad news, and Inde is heartbroken and enraged. This is the final straw. The young rebel leaders decide it's time for a full uprising. They will storm the governor's castle and rescue their loved ones, come what may. Under the cover of night, Inde leads his band of armed peasants in a surprise raid on the governor's stronghold. They manage to slip into town, overpower the guards, and break into the jail, finding Inde's mother and brother, who were badly beaten but still alive. A fierce fight erupts as the rebels clash with the remaining garrison. The cowardly governor tries to flee, but Inde personally cuts him down, ending the tyrant's life with one swing of his sword. They overthrew the local government, a rousing victory for the people. But the jubilation is short-lived, because now the king himself gets involved. News of the rebellion and rumours of a monster ally reach the royal court. The king, furious that peasants have dared revolt, dispatches his most feared general, General Fuan, with a large army to crush the uprising. The peasant rebels, now joined by scores of villagers, retreat to the remote Mount Maru to make a stand. They form a guerrilla base in the mountains, vowing to fight for their freedom. What follows is a series of battles that escalate in true kaiju movie fashion. General Fuan's troops march into the mountain valley. The rebels, being clever and on home turf, launch a surprise counterattack, rolling logs and boulders downhill and then charging with spears. The peasants rout the first royal attack. General Fuan, embarrassed by his losses, tries devious tactics. In one scene, he lays siege to Mount Maru, encircling the rebels to starve them out. This leads to a grim montage. The rebels run out of food and even resort to boiling tree bark and eating roots to survive. Some fighters attempt to break the siege and get help, but they're captured or killed. Ami herself ventures out to find food and nearly gets caught by royal soldiers, only to be saved when Pulgasari suddenly appears again and scares the soldiers off, carrying Ami safely back to camp. Pulgasari's intervention convinces any doubters that the creature truly is a heaven-sent guardian. With renewed faith, the rebels decide to break the siege decisively. In a spectacular battle, Ami and Inde lead Pulgasari and the starving peasant army in a downhill, all-out assault on the besieging forces. The sight of a now gigantic Pulgasari charging sends the king's troops into a panicked retreat. The rebels win and seize a bounty of weapons. The first battle is a huge win for the peasant army. They celebrate and feed all the captured weapons to Pulgasari as a reward. From here, the rebels adopt a strategy of use war to fuel the war. Every victory yields more iron for Pulgasari to consume, which in turn makes the monster grow and secure the next victory. Pulgasari essentially becomes the rebellion's living battering ram and mascot, leading the charge in battle after battle. Over a few sequences, we witness Pulgasari evolve from human-sized to giant monster proportions, towering like a building as the rebels win skirmish after skirmish. The king's armies are repeatedly beaten, and General Fuan grows increasingly desperate. North Korea's propagandistic intent here is clear. The peasants, symbolizing the righteous proletariat, are literally unstoppable when aided by the might of Pulgasari. By now, Pulgasari has grown into a colossal kaiju, large enough to take on fortresses. Indeed, the final act sees the rebels, with Pulgasari at the front, march on the royal palace to overthrow the tyrant king once and for all. At one point, a fleeing advisor suggests a weakness. Since Pulgasari was created by the blacksmith spirit to protect Ami, if they capture Ami, they might control the monster. Sneaky spies infiltrate the rebels' camp during a victory celebration and kidnap Ami. General Fuan holds Ami hostage atop a hill and demands Pulgasari surrender to save her. In a poignant moment, Ami cries out, telling Pulgasari to ignore the trap, but the noble beast cannot bear to see its family harmed. Pulgasari voluntarily walks into a giant iron cage that the army has prepared. Immediately, Fuan's men slam the cage shut and ignite huge bonfires all around it. They're trying to burn Pulgasari alive. As flames engulf the cage, Pulgasari lets out agonized roars and eventually collapses, seemingly succumbing to the fire. The soldiers break into triumphant cheers at having slain the monster, while the rebels and villagers watch in horror and despair. But if monster movies have taught us anything, it's that you should never celebrate too early. In a sudden twist, Pulgasari explodes out of the fiery cage in a burst of smoke and flame. The creature has not died, it is transformed. Emerging from the inferno, Pulgasari's entire body is now glowing red-hot like molten metal. It underwent a kind of super-evolution from the attempted execution. Now even more formidable, the blazing Pulgasari stomps toward the king's forces. The soldiers, who moments ago were smugly laughing, are struck dumb with fear. They scramble onto boats to flee across a river that borders the palace. Pulgasari, still radiating heat, wades into the water after them. In an unintentionally hilarious and awesome display, the monster's red-hot body boils the river water on contact, causing scalding steam that fatally cooks many of the fleeing soldiers. Pulgasari then flips the boats for good measure. General Fuan barely escapes with a handful of men. The ambush has failed spectacularly. Once again, Pulgasari stands tall, and the ragtag peasant army rejoices. With their indestructible monster ally, they charge through the breach toward the royal palace. The showdown unfolds at the capital. The king, now practically weeping with panic, orders his last resort: secret superweapons. His alchemists wheel out enormous cannons known as the Lion Cannon and General Cannon, huge artillery pieces meant to slay Pulgasari. They fire cannonballs directly at the monster. But Pulgasari just shrugs them off. In a cheeky move, Pulgasari even catches one cannonball in its mouth, chomps it and spits it back at the palace, blowing up a portion of the king's fortress. With that, any remaining royal forces lose their nerve. Pulgasari and the peasant insurgents storm into the palace walls. In a rampage reminiscent of Godzilla tearing through Tokyo, Pulgasari smashes buildings left and right. The evil General Fuan tries one last attack, but gets literally crushed by a falling palace column. The cowardly king makes a break for it, but the monster stomps on him like he's an ant, squishing the tyrant beneath its foot. Victory. The feudal regime falls, the people are free, and Pulgasari roars in triumph amid the wreckage of the old order. The peasants cheer. It's the ultimate revolutionary fairy tale ending. Or so it seems. Here, Pulgasari delivers its most unexpected twist, one that elevates it above a simple monster romp. With the war over, the common folk try to return to their lives. But Pulgasari, now a massive living creature, is still very much around, and it is still hungry. Having eaten all the weapons of the tyrants, Pulgasari's appetite turns to whatever iron remains, which now includes the tools and farming implements of the very peasants it helped liberate. The villagers initially revere Pulgasari as their savior, but quickly they grow fearful and resentful as it starts devouring their plows, hoes, and cooking pots. If they let this continue, they realize, Pulgasari will consume every iron tool in Korea. The once heroic monster is becoming a new source of misery. Army, who loves Pulgasari like family, tries desperately to persuade it to curb its appetite. In a heartfelt scene, she stands before the towering beast and pleads with it. Please, Pulgasari, you must stop eating iron. If you finish all of ours, you'll force us to invade other lands for more. You'll bring endless war. We can't let that happen. The monster listens but does not understand. It's driven by its nature. Army realizes with dread that Pulgasari has become a threat to the very peace they fought for. The creature that liberated them is now poised to be their oppressor, albeit unwittingly, due to its boundless greed. This is a surprisingly nuanced development for what was a straightforward people's hero monster. Army faces an agonizing decision. She concludes that Pulgasari must be destroyed for the good of the country. But how do you kill an immortal monster born of magic and blood? Army deduces that since Pulgasari was given life by her blood, and by extension contains her father's spirit, it may also be vulnerable to her life force. In other words, only by sacrificing herself can she neutralize Pulgasari. It's a classic, tragic twist. The pure-hearted heroine must give up everything to stop the cycle of violence. And so, Army carries out a plan as heartbreaking as it is heroic. She has a massive iron bell cast, a huge temple bell, and lures Pulgasari to it by ringing it loudly from a bell tower. Pulgasari, true to form, cannot resist this giant hunk of iron. The monster rushes over and swallows the great bell in a single gulp, not realizing that Ami hid herself inside the bell at the last moment. In an instant, Pulgasari consumes Ami along with the bell, and the prophecy comes true. The monster that cannot be killed meets its end from within, ingesting the one person whose blood gave it life. Pulgasari steps back, confused. Then its mighty body begins to crumble from the inside out. In a rather well-done sequence, the giant monster shatters and disintegrates into dust, collapsing in a heap of ashes. Pulgasari is no more, and Ami too perishes in the process, her sacrifice ensuring that no new tyranny will plague the land. The final shot is somber. Ami and Pulgasari's ashes blow away together. Thus ends Pulgasari, not with a simplistic happy ending, but with a poignant message. Revolution can devour its children if we're not careful, and true peace sometimes requires the ultimate sacrifice. The poor villagers are free from both the king and the monster now. They begin rebuilding their lives with hope, albeit mourning Ami, the savior who saved them from their savior. As a monster movie, Pulgasari delivers plenty of cheese and spectacle. Medieval battles, a goofy but endearing creature smashing miniatures, formulaic heroics. But it's that twist ending that packs a surprisingly thought-provoking punch. This wasn't just a mindless rip-off of Godzilla. It was a dark parable to whatever you might think of. And coming from North Korea, the land of rigid propaganda, that is truly fascinating.
And when they saw Pulgasari, people from Toho were actually saying that it was more entertaining than Godzilla 85. The director and his wife were both from North Korea, and they had to actually escape from North Korea. August will ask you more details, but they were stuck there for a long time and actually had to escape.
On the surface, Pulgasari is a fantasy action fairy tale about peasants overthrowing a feudal lord with the help of a seemingly friendly monster. This by itself fits neatly into North Korea's propaganda mold. Many of their films, like The Flower Girl and other projects overseen by Kim Jong-il, depict the cruel injustices of the old society and thus carry messages of rise against oppression. Indeed, Pulgasari hammers the recurring theme that the common people, when united, can topple an unjust regime. In that sense, Pulgasari the monster represents the power of the masses, or the spirit of revolution, a socialist Godzilla stomping out the old Koryo feudalism. This aligns well with North Korea's self-image, as they see their own history as one of righteous revolution against Japanese colonizers and capitalist oppressors. So it's no surprise the film encourages collective action and condemns despotic kings and greedy landlords. The propaganda parallels are not subtle. The evil governor and king in the movie clearly stand in for all old-world tyrants, while the peasants are righteous revolutionaries. However, what makes Pulgasari intriguing is its second layer of metaphors, which is almost subversive to the regime. The monster, despite being born from a good man's prayer, becomes an uncontrollable force that nearly establishes a new form of oppression. Scholars and critics have noted that Pulgasari can be seen as a cautionary symbol of how revolutions can turn into new tyrannies if their appetite for power, or in the film's case, iron, grows unchecked. In Pulgasari, iron is not just a material. It is the entire structure of power in the feudal world that the film depicts. Iron is what the ruling class controls, hoards, and uses to maintain authority through weapons, farming tools, shackles, and the infrastructure of production. Whoever controls iron controls the means of life and the means of violence. So when Pulgasari eats iron, he is destroying the foundation of the ruling class. The revolution literally nourishes itself on the remains of the system it destroys. However, after liberating the people, iron is no longer the means of force and violence, but the means of production and life. Pulgasari itself became the violent force that threatened the livelihood of the people. The peasants harness Pulgasari to overthrow the old ruling class, but once that's done, the monster threatens to become a ruling force of its own, consuming resources and endangering the people it liberated. This creates a cyclical view of power that today's liberator can become tomorrow's oppressor. It's a shockingly candid theme to appear in a North Korean film, given that it could be interpreted as a critique of its own authoritarian regime. Some see it as Shin Sang-ok's personal artistic touch, or even a hidden criticism aimed at the Kim dynasty, inserted cleverly enough to get past censors. Only through Army's pure-hearted sacrifice, supposedly representing the socialist ideals of selflessness and purity, is the cycle prevented, and peace is ultimately found. The film's ending has a strong critical tone, almost warning that only through personal sacrifice and virtue can the lure of power be destroyed for good. This gives Pulgasari an unexpected depth beyond the standard North Korean propaganda. Parallels to Godzilla abound as well, not just in production, but in theme. Just as Toho's original Godzilla was a metaphor for nuclear destruction that the monster awakened by atomic bombs, Pulgasari serves as a metaphor for social upheaval and the double-edged nature of revolutionary power. The Pulgasari legend itself comes from an actual Korean folklore, a creature that eats iron and is said to be indestructible. In one version of the myth, it can only be killed by fire, and interestingly, the film referred to this lore through the failed fire execution scene. By reviving an old legend, the film gave itself cultural roots, but clearly Shin and his writers adapted it to deliver a modern allegory. The peasants needed Pulgasari's power to win their freedom, yet they cannot rely on an all-powerful entity indefinitely, or people would end up being oppressed in a new way. Did Kim Jong-il grasp that parallel, that North Korea's own revolution had led to a dynastic dictatorship? It's hard to say, really. Perhaps Kim saw Pulgasari simply as the embodiment of righteous violence that must be guided by pure revolutionary spirit, like the virtues of the Workers' Party. Regardless of how, the film intrigued many international audiences. It's propaganda with a probably intentional paradox. In summary, Pulgasari slyly suggests that revolution isn't the end of the story. One must be vigilant that the new order does not replicate the old injustices. This dual symbolism of liberator versus oppressor makes Pulgasari a surprisingly thought-provoking fable, hidden in a monster movie. Little did Kim Jong-il know, the cautionary aspect might very well be read as a critique of his own regime.
아무도 없느냐? 제발 구해주시오.
As cameras stopped rolling on Pulgasari in late 1985, events in the real world took a dramatic turn that could have been ripped from a thriller film. Shin Sang-ok and Choi Eun-hee had been dutifully making Kim's movies for a few years, biding their treasured time. But they never stopped looking for a chance to escape. In early 1986, that chance finally came. Kim Jong-il, eager to show off his cinematic triumphs, allowed Shin and Choi to travel to a film festival in Europe. Of course, the trip was closely supervised. According to their later testimonies, the couple carefully plotted their defection without alerting anyone. In March 1986, while Pulgasari was still in post-production, about sound mixing, Shin Sang-ok and Choi Eun-hee made a break for freedom. They were in Vienna attending a film event when they managed to slip away from their minders and run straight into the US Embassy to request asylum. It was an incredibly risky move. Had their North Korean guards caught wind minutes earlier, the end of this story might have been very grim. But they nonetheless succeeded. The kidnapped celebrity filmmakers of Pyongyang were now safe in American protection. Shortly thereafter, they held a press conference that blew the lid off the whole astonishing saga. Shin and Choi publicly announced that they had been abducted by North Korea, held against their will for 8 years, and forced to make films for Kim Jong-il. Oh, what about all those statements they made in Pyongyang about coming voluntarily? Lies under duress. They had no other choice. The world was stunned by their account, which sounded too bizarre to be true. To prove it, Shin even had secret audio recordings of Kim Jong-il himself admitting to the kidnapping plot.
인터넷 자유가 없기 때문에 그냥 우리 애티적으로는 진정한 자유를 찾아서 진정한 자유를 찾아서 우리 상당히 자유를 보장받기 위해서 내가 지금 왔다는 거고 그거 나쁘게 되겠다. 응? 그 그룹화를 만들어서 그 보호하면서 다니면요 절대 단신 행동이라는 건 있을 수 없는 거고요.
신상옥, 채은이 부부는
Those tapes, later released, corroborated their story and deeply embarrassed the North Korean regime on the international stage. Kim Jong-il, upon hearing of Shin and Choi's defection, was reportedly furious and mortified. Here were his star director and actress, whom he had bragged were working in Pyongyang willingly, now telling the globe about his cinematic crimes. North Korea immediately went into damage control. The regime officially denied any kidnapping, insisting that Shin and Choi had voluntarily come and now were slandering the DPRK because they were traitors. Needless to say, nobody outside North Korea really believed that. In an Orwellian style, North Korean authorities immediately started scrambling to erase or downplay Shin's involvement in Pulgasari. Even though Shin Sang-ok had directed the entire film, the North Korean release prints suddenly listed a different director in the credits. Chong Gon-jo, one of Shin's assistants, was given credit as if he had made the movie. This was most likely done to save face after Shin's defection. Kim Jong-il couldn't bear to admit that his monster movie masterpiece was directed by a man who had betrayed him. So he retroactively rewrote history and promoted an underling to credited director. But of course, the international film community pretty much unanimously recognizes Pulgasari as Shin Sang-ok's work, regardless of North Korea's official claims. Back in Pyongyang, Pulgasari itself became a subject of mystery. Some sources suggest that after Shin's escape, Kim Jong-il banned the film domestically out of spite, as if to purge the memory of Shin's involvement. Another report, citing a North Korean defector, claims that Pulgasari did get a limited release in North Korea and was actually quite popular with audiences. Apparently, they enjoyed the spectacle and the propaganda value, and it was the talk of the town for a while. Some other source, such as one coming from a Japanese company that was involved in the production, claims that Pulgasari was pulled from circulation and never officially shown in North Korea after 1986 because of Shin's defection. To this day, the truth is uncertain, and Pulgasari's status in North Korea remains ambiguous. It may have been shelved for decades or shown only to select internal audiences. Kim Jong-il certainly never spoke of it in public again. It's as if the film became an orphaned child, beloved in the moment of its creation, then cast aside when its parent ran away.
Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il built up a large revolutionary force of artists and ushered in the heyday of socialist art and literature. From the early 1960s, Kim Jong-il took charge of art and literature about which Kim Il-sung was concerned. He developed Korean literature and art into revolutionary and militant art and literature which truly served the people. Looking back on those impressive days,
what is certain is that Pulgasari was effectively the last of Kim Jong-il's grand film experiments. With Shin Sang-ok gone, Kim's brief flirtation with having a world-class film industry fizzled. North Korea's studio churned out more propaganda movies in the ensuing years, but none had the flair or international attention that Shin's projects did. The loss of Shin and Choi was a huge blow to Kim's cinematic ambitions. As a coder of sorts, Shin and Choi managed to trick Kim with a critical financial hit. Reportedly, when they escaped, they siphoned off about $2.5 million of Kim's money, funds that had been given to them for filmmaking or future projects. In interviews, Shin dryly justified it by referencing the hardships they endured, essentially saying, "Consider it 8 years of unpaid wages." For North Korea, that was no trivial sum. By the late 1980s, the country was already sliding into economic crisis, and that $2.5 million could have been used to feed a lot of people, or, perhaps, to make more monster movies. The fact that Kim had allocated such a budget for filmmaking shows how much he prioritized movies, even as his nation struggled financially. It's almost poetic justice that Shin took that money, something Shin somehow deserved. Shin Sang-ok and Choi Eun-hee eventually made it back to South Korea after a brief asylum in the US, where they were welcomed as heroes who survived a real-life horror story. Their tale grabbed headlines worldwide and even inspired books and documentaries. Meanwhile, Kim Jong-il quietly continued his rule in North Korea, focusing on other propaganda avenues. Kim Jong-il would go on to lead North Korea until his death in 2011, remembered as much for his eccentricities, like his cinephilia and gourmet taste, as for his oppressive regime. The Pulgasari incident stands as one of the strangest episodes in the annals of film and geopolitics, a reminder that truth is stranger than fiction. For a film born out of abduction and sealed away behind the Iron Curtain, Pulgasari has had a surprisingly extraordinary afterlife. Years after 1985, the movie was practically impossible to see outside North Korea. It wasn't until the mid-1990s that Pulgasari escaped its own cage and rampaged onto the international scene, this time as a cult curiosity. How did that happen? Largely thanks to distribution deals made in Japan. In a twist of fate, the country that gave the world Godzilla also became the gateway for Pulgasari's global debut. In 1995, a Japanese company under the label Twin secured rights and released Pulgasari on VHS tape in Japan. This was the first time the film became accessible to general audiences outside North Korea. Niche monster movie fans were understandably intrigued. A lost North Korean kaiju film directed by a kidnapped auteur. It sounded like a myth, but now one could watch it, even if on a grainy VHS with subtitles. The VHS release built up enough underground buzz that a few years later, in July 1998, Pulgasari got an actual theatrical premiere in Tokyo. Yes, 13 years after it was made, Pulgasari screened commercially in Japanese cinemas for the first time, and it was a minor hit. In one Tokyo theatre, the movie drew over 18,000 viewers during its run. It even broke some local box office records for repertory screenings, proving that curiosity about this bizarre film was a great marketing hook. Japanese critics and fans received it rather positively, with many noting that Pulgasari was more entertaining than the 1998 American Godzilla remake. Imagine that! Kim Jong-il's pet monster outshone a Hollywood Godzilla in the eyes of some superfans. The Japanese release cemented Pulgasari as a cult favorite among kaiju enthusiasts. It was no longer an obscure rumor. It became the stuff of midnight movie screenings and monster movie marathon events. South Korea, the homeland of Shin and Choi, had a more complicated reaction. For a long time, anything associated with North Korea was taboo or outright banned in the South. But with Shin Sang-ok's return and the passage of time, Pulgasari eventually found its way to a South Korean release as well. Around the same time as Japan's release, Pulgasari was shown in South Korea in select theaters. Reportedly the first North Korean-made film ever commercially screened in the South. At least 50 cinemas showed it, making it a fairly wide release for such a niche piece. However, South Korean audiences didn't flock to see the commie monster movie quite like the Japanese did. The novelty of Pulgasari in the South was met with more skepticism or disinterest. Box office reports say the film flopped in South Korea, selling fewer than 1,000 tickets total. In some theaters, literally only a handful of people showed up. Within a week, Pulgasari was pulled from most South Korean theaters due to the poor turnout. Perhaps for South Koreans, the wounds of the kidnapping and the notion of cheering a film made under duress were still too fresh. Or maybe they just found it to be a cheesy monster flick, not worth the price of admission. Either way, Pulgasari didn't attain cult status in the South the way it did elsewhere. Meanwhile, in the West, Pulgasari gradually gained notoriety through word of mouth among cult cinema circles. It started getting mentioned in magazine articles, books, and eventually the internet as North Korea's insane Godzilla knockoff. The film was featured at various genre film festivals and special screenings. It became a highlight of bad film clubs and midnight showings, often presented with its unbelievable backstory recounted beforehand to enhance the viewing experience. In that context, Pulgasari shines as a pure, so bad it's good masterpiece. Not because it's technically awful, but because the context is so absurd that you can't help but watch in astonishment. The monster itself, a man in a rubber suit rampaging through what is clearly a miniature landscape, evokes the charm of vintage kaiju films. The added layer of "this was produced by a dictator" turns every scene into a kind of dark comedy. When you see villagers begging Pulgasari to stop eating their pans, you might chuckle and think, was this Kim Jong-il's subtle nod to his own policies? Probably not, but who knows? Critically, aside from the novelty, Pulgasari has earned some genuine appreciation among monster movie fans. The special effects by the Toho team are decent for the era, and the historical setting gives it a unique flavor compared to city-stomping Godzilla movies. Some have even called it one of the best non-Japanese kaiju films ever made, though, to be fair, it doesn't have much competition in that niche category. Over time, it has also become the most widely seen North Korean film internationally, which is rather ironic. North Korea has produced hundreds of films, mostly propaganda dramas that never leave the country. Yet this one monster flick, thanks to its outrageous origin story, has travelled farther and been seen by more people around the world than any other North Korean cultural product. In a way, Pulgasari succeeded in giving North Korea a sort of fame, or say infamy, on the global stage. It is not quite the prestigious art house acclaim Kim Jong-il might have wanted, but a place in pop culture history nonetheless. It's a cult classic, featured on countless weirdest films ever made lists, and the subject of endless YouTube essays and podcasts, including this very episode. As for Shin Sang-ok and Choi Yun-hee, their post-defection careers had a few interesting footnotes. Shin actually went on to direct a couple of low-budget films in Hollywood. Most notably, he was a producer on the Three Ninjas kids movie series in the 90s. In South Korea, he regained respect as a veteran director until his passing in 2006. Choi Yun-hee lived until 2018, revered as a legendary actress. They both recounted their North Korean ordeal in memoirs and interviews, ensuring the story behind Pulgasari would not be forgotten. Kim Jong-il, for his part, never managed to create another international hit. Pulgasari unintentionally became his most famous film venture. Decades later, in 2011, a rather surreal coda occurred. Pulgasari was screened at the Bucheon International Fantastic Film Festival in South Korea, with an audience including Westerners and even some defected North Koreans. It was essentially presented as part of film history, the monster movie that a dictator created. One can only imagine what Kim, who had died just a few months prior, would have thought of that scene. Today, Pulgasari is freely available online and on home media, often found in bootleg compilations or on YouTube. It stands as an international cult oddity, beloved not because it's a masterpiece, but because its existence is so unlikely and its production story so jaw-dropping. It's a film that prompts viewers to ask, how the hell was this made? And then you get to tell the tale of kidnappings, propaganda, and a beer-delivering surveillance fridge.
I'm so lonely, so lonely.
In the end, Pulgasari is far more than just a campy monster movie. It's a living relic of one of history's most bizarre intersections of art and power. It forces us to consider the role of propaganda and the limits of creative control under dictatorship. Kim Jong-il saw film as the ultimate tool for shaping reality, as he famously said that film is a powerful weapon for indoctrination, and then wielded it with zeal. He built an entire cinematic machine in service of his ideology, going so far as to commit international crimes to obtain the talent he thought North Korea lacked. In Pulgasari, Kim got what he wanted on the surface, a flashy epic with himself as the grand puppeteer. Yet ironically, the film's legacy escaped his grasp, much like its director did. There's a poetic symmetry to the story of Pulgasari. Just as the monster Pulgasari in the film grows beyond control and threatens the people who created it, the film Pulgasari grew beyond Kim Jong-il's control and became something he never intended. A cautionary tale and a source of global dark humor at his expense. Propaganda can be a double-edged sword. Kim attempted to use a monster movie to glorify revolution and his leadership's ideals, but that same movie now stands as a testament to the absurdity and hubris of authoritarianism. People don't watch Pulgasari today to learn about class struggle. They watch it to marvel at how a dictator's fantasy had manifested in the most unimaginable ways. The very existence of Pulgasari tells us that even in the most repressive environments, art has a way of reflecting truths and ironies that the powers in charge might not see themselves. Ultimately, the saga of Pulgasari carries a sobering lesson wrapped in an outlandish package. It shows how art under a dictatorship becomes a battleground of control versus creativity. It highlights the lengths a regime will go to project soft power, even while revealing the regime's insecurities. And it stands as a bizarre but true, meaningful tale, that trying to weaponize art can create monsters of its own. Pulgasari will always be a standout example of truth being stranger than fiction. It's the film born of an act of tyranny that somehow morphed into a campfire story whispered among movie buffs worldwide. In the film, the iron-eating monster from the legend was vanquished by human goodness. But the legend of Pulgasari lives on, an immortal story in its own right, roaring in the halls of cult cinema lore, long after the dictators and Cold War games have faded to dust.
And until then, I'll just be lonely. Yeah, little lonely.